So my name is Kelley Adams. I'm from MIT. I'm here to talk about the MIT Sexual Assault Survey that we did in 2014. There is a lot of information in these slides, and it's information that I've talked about a lot, so I might go relatively fast. So if that happens, please just shoot up a hand. I'll slow down. And please ask questions and share your thoughts on this as we go through. I've built in extra time for discussion. I would rather have it be more of a discussion than me just talking at you. So please feel free to share what's on your mind. So just a little bit about me. My background is in public health. This is an old picture, sorry. I've been at MIT for about 5 years now. I'm in violence prevention and response, so I'm one of the victim advocates there. I also do programming on campus, and my role has changed a little bit as we've expanded. Now I'm more the research and evaluation person for the office. So today I'm going to start off by talking about climate surveys and prevention generally, how they're connected. I'm going to move into talking about the MIT survey in particular, and then I'm going to wrap up with sort of a general framework that I've created after going through the whole process of creating and administering the MIT survey. So, and just so you know, in these section slides, I have photographs of all things from like MIT's campus and MIT's like cool inventions and stuff. So that's what these are. So just to start with, who knows what the social ecological model is? Raise your hand. Raise them high. Be proud. Yes. Pretty much everyone. So basically what it says is that no individual exists in a vacuum, therefore no behavior exists in a vacuum. So behavior is impacted by things at each of these levels, and that includes risk factors and protective factors. But just broadly, we can think about how a certain behavior, say sexual assault, is impacted by an individual's personal history and circumstances, as well as their peers and relationships, and thinking about the settings in which those relationships occur, in addition to the broader societal level influences like politics and health and policies and laws and things like that. So keeping that framework in mind, if we're thinking about sexual assault does not exist in a vacuum. So when we're thinking about doing a survey to find out about sexual assault in a certain environment, it doesn't make sense to just ask about sexual assault. That'll give us some information, but it won't give us the full picture. So we need to think about individual history and experiences, as well as conceptualization of those experiences, so how people think about what they've experienced. Thinking about gender, sexual, and other forms of harassment, how those are tied to sexual assault, and how those contribute to the climate in which sexual assault happens. Thinking about power dynamics and structures, social norms around gender, violence, and aggression, as well as sexual entitlement, and lastly, that top-level laws and institutional policies. So here are some examples of how climate survey data can tie directly into prevention. So, for example, what we found is that 72% of students who said they had some experience that constituted sexual assault since they'd been at MIT said that the perpetrator was another student. I want to be clear, the rest, the other 28%, are not strangers. They're other people affiliated with MIT or friends and acquaintances and things like that. It was a very small percentage of true stranger perpetrators. But this is important for us to know so we can sort of dispel that myth of the stranger rape, the common stranger rape narrative that I think most people hold on to. Additionally, we found that about a third of our undergraduates agree or strongly agree that sexual assault and rape can happen because men can get carried away in sexual situations once they've started. That's really depressing. I was sad to find that, but it's important for us to know, right? Because if this is a common belief, that again is contributing to the environment in which sexual harassment, sexual violence, and other forms of disrespect and violence happen. And then lastly, this is a very MIT particular one, but we found that 62% of females and 43% of males reported hearing someone suggest or imply that women don't have to meet the same standards that men do to get into MIT. So, more campus specific, but still very relevant to the prevention work that we're doing on campus. So with that background, I'm going to move on to the MIT survey and talk about just that for a little while. So does everyone know there was an MIT survey? Yes, okay, I assume so. All right. So it got a lot of coverage when we put out the results. Mostly positive, but basically, sorry, just a lot. Um, and there are a couple of reasons for that, but here's a specific example of some of the feedback we got. So this was in the New York Times. Um, this writer said that there have been few surveys that looked at experiences and attitudes at particular colleges, and victim advocates said they knew of none with the clarity and depth of the MIT survey. So Andrea Pino, who knows who that is? Raise your hand. Yep. An activist who has helped file federal complaints about sexual assault against dozens of colleges says she hoped that other colleges would follow MIT's example. She said the Institute's survey covered more ground than any she had seen and did not muddy the waters with vaguely worded questions as some surveys had done. So this was a process that took a lot of work. We did it in a short amount of time, but it really was worth it because this was sort of the reaction that we got, and it was supported by and large. So why the MIT survey? What made it different than other surveys? Why is it worth talking about on its own? So there are a few things. So we created and administered it prior to the release of the White House Task Force report. And that was the report that talked about climate surveys and how they would likely become a mandate in the future for schools. We had a great response rate. 35% doesn't sound awesome as a percentage, but some people are nodding. Yeah, that's a pretty good response rate. Yeah, thanks. I think so. Yeah. We also decided to go with depth versus breadth. So I forgot to say in the beginning, I am the person, because I have a public health background and my focus is in qualitative and quantitative research, I'm the person that largely wrote the tool. It was made by a committee, but I was the person who was sort of driving what the tool looked like. So initially, when I created a draft, I wanted to put everything into it, right? Like, I want to know about sexual violence, partner violence, I want to know about stalking, like all this stuff. It was probably 80 pages or something crazy, right? And so obviously that wasn't going to fly either on the committee side or the user side. How many people are going to sit through that many pages of questions, right? And so what we decided to do was, rather than getting sort of a broad snapshot of each of these issues, we decided to focus on sexual violence and go into depth. I'll talk about that more in a moment. We asked about campus-specific attitudes, behaviors, and concerns. So an example I gave of that already was the belief that women don't have to meet the same intellectual standards that men do. That's very campus-specific, but important that we have on there. Oops, sorry. We also asked about students' beliefs. So we asked them how strongly they agreed or disagreed with various rape myths and statements, but we also asked how strongly they thought the average peer agreed or disagreed. So we had that data built right in there. We could say, you know, the actual proportion of students that agree with this rape myth is X%, but the perceived social norm is much higher, right? And I think we've heard of this work being done more in the alcohol field, so the perception that everyone else is drinking a lot more than I am. So that was an important piece of the survey. And the reason those three in the bottom are blue are those are the ones that are have the most direct connection to prevention work. Lastly, this one was unexpected. We sort of, as we were finalizing the draft of the survey, we thought, you know, we should give people a chance to say what they want to say. We should just put a comment box on every page and say, if you have anything else to say, if you have questions, whatever, please put them in this box. People took advantage of that to a degree that none of us were expecting. So I'll give you an example. We had a question at the end of the survey that was a hypothetical resource utilization question. So the question was, hypothetically, in the future, if you're sexually assaulted, here's all the resources on campus and in our community, which ones would you use? And people could say, you know, this resource, yes, I'd use it, no, I wouldn't use it, or I'm not sure, I don't really know what that is. So if you clicked no on any of them, a box popped up and said, you know, you said you wouldn't use this resource. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? 1,400 people took the time to fill that out and tell us stories of experiences they've had with different offices, how they perceive them, what they've heard about them. And so that was some of the richest data that came out of the survey. It was really great. So I'm going to talk about the tool in more detail and give you some examples of questions that came out of each section. So this isn't everything on the survey, but these are the major sections. So we asked about personal attitudes and perceived social norms, like I mentioned. So here's an example. This is a pretty common rape myth, right? When someone is raped or sexually assaulted, it's often because the way they said no was unclear or there was some miscommunication. So we ask people, how strongly do you agree or disagree with this statement? So it's a lot of information up here, but focus inside the yellow rectangle. So this is undergraduate males responding. The first bar is how strongly that undergraduate male agrees or disagrees with that statement. The next bar is how strongly they think the average undergrad female agrees or disagrees. And the third one is how strongly they think the average undergrad male agrees or disagrees. The important point to take away from this is look at the difference between the leftmost column or bar and the rightmost. The leftmost are undergraduate males themselves, but they perceive undergraduate males to endorse these beliefs much more strongly than they do in reality. Any questions on that? Okay. Absolutely. All the slides and everything are available on the site, the conference site. And there's actually a couple handouts on there, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, please feel free to take a picture of anything you like. Okay. We also asked about sexual and gender harassment. So here's an example. What we did is we asked, given these following experiences, have you had these experiences in various settings? So the one in the red rectangle is, has anyone made inappropriate comments about your or someone else's body, appearance, or attractiveness in your presence? And then on the survey it said, has this happened in a social setting at MIT? Has it happened in a more formal class, lab, or work setting? Has it happened in other settings? And this graph is strictly class, lab, or work settings, so presumably the most formal, controlled settings on campus. Despite that, we found that 1 in 5 female grad students had that experience in a class, lab, or work setting. In terms of sexual assault, we had 2 sets of questions. So we asked label-based experiences, and what I mean by that is straightforward, have you been sexually assaulted at MIT? Have you been raped at MIT? We also asked a bank of questions that were very anatomically correct, behaviorally specific experiences that constitute sexual assault, but don't use that term. Don't use any terms like sexual assault or violence or anything like that. And we asked about victimization as well as perpetration before MIT and since being at MIT. So I'll give you some of those numbers. The way that the results were released were in 2 categories. So the first one was sexual assault that was accomplished through force, threats, or incapacitation. The second one is a larger category that we call sexual misconduct, and that includes sexual harassment, which is a label-based question. So have you experienced sexual harassment at MIT? And we provided a definition, as well as sexual assault, rape, and sexual coercion. So really sexual assault accomplished through other means that weren't force, threats, or incapacitation. But keep in mind that this second category encompasses the first one. So any questions on that? I know that's kind of weird and complicated. Okay, so this is what we found. In terms of sexual assault through force, threats, or incapacitation, we found that we had a prevalence rate among undergraduate women of 17%. It was 5% for both undergrad men and grad women, and then 1% for grad men. And compare that to the sexual misconduct category. So we found that more than a third of our undergraduate women had experienced at least one of these since they had been at MIT. Okay, so in addition to that, we asked a lot about those who had an experience since being at MIT. We asked about disclosures, reporting, and responses received to those disclosures. So we found a couple things. One of our main questions was we asked people, regardless of what you decided to do in terms of reporting, were each of these statements part of your decision-making process? So, for example, we found that thinking that the incident wasn't serious enough or thinking that, it wasn't clear that this person meant to hurt me. Those were the two most common thoughts that were involved in the decision-making process around reporting. The next most common were feeling ashamed, right? I don't think anyone is surprised by this, or feeling like it was partly or all that person's fault. There is a substantial proportion of respondents who said that they did not want action taken, and that was a big part of their decision-making process. There are also some factors that had to do with the perpetrator, so they didn't want to get the perpetrator in trouble, or a common phrase that we hear at MIT is we didn't want to ruin their life. And I think that comes from discourse around, students at MIT are some of the best in the world. They're changing the world. They're doing amazing work. And so it's viewed as if you mess someone's career up at MIT or after, that literally is ruining their life. And you could come back and say, well, what about what sexual assault does to people's lives? But that's another topic. And lastly, survivors feeling like they didn't have any proof. So why would they report? So the last couple major sections were about outcomes and impacts. So we asked questions about PTSD symptoms, and we asked about various areas of life that were impacted by their experiences. And then lastly, we had that hypothetical resource utilization question that I described earlier. So hypothetically, if you were assaulted, would you use these resources? So I want to talk about context and why we were able to do a survey of that magnitude, do it at that time, and do it successfully. So it's important to know that within the past couple of years, so this survey took place in 2014. I believe in late 2012, 2013 was when MIT was revising its policies, especially around interpersonal violence and sexual misconduct. And we now have very clear, extensive, progressive policies. We have a policy on effective consent that's more than a page long, talks about coercion, pressure, and so that was sort of happening in the background. Simultaneously, there was lots of movement around Title IX at MIT. So prior to, I would say, 2013, we had a Title IX coordinator on campus who was also I believe, the vice president of HR at MIT. And so it was sort of one of many hats that she wore. To no fault of her own, right? Being VP of HR is a busy job. She wasn't that well informed about Title IX. And as there was more national coverage of the issue and things were changing on campus, we decided to put a stronger Title IX structure in place. So we had just hired our first Title IX investigator in late 2013. We set up a deputy coordinator infrastructure throughout all the different schools. So it's important to keep those two things in mind. This was sort of happening in the background. This is a timeline I'm going to talk about more in detail. But at the beginning of 2014, an alum submitted a story of sexual assault to the student paper. It was published in January. We had a brand new chancellor who began in February. The president of MIT responded publicly to that survivor piece at the beginning of February, and at the same time charged the chancellor with taking on the issue of sexual assault at MIT. Around the same time we were developing the survey, so March through May, we were also doing listening sessions, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. So the survivor piece that was in the tech, I want to give you a heads up. There's a couple quotes in here, and they include discussion of rape. Nothing super graphic, but that is going to come up on the screen, so do what you need to do to take care of yourself as we move through this. So the important things to know about this are that this was not the first survivor story in the tech in our student paper by any means. There had been several over the years. The first one appeared, more than a decade ago. But what was different this time is we had a relatively new president, we had a new chancellor, and this piece in particular was a very clear story of rape and sexual assault that I think was easy for people to understand. It was a young woman who was sexually assaulted by a mentor who wasn't her supervisor directly, but basically had more power than her in the place in which she worked. She this narrative also showed that she sort of did the right thing in that she reported and she sought services. That's sort of what I mean by that. So that's what people who, don't know that much about sexual assault would expect to see. That sort of fits with like the good victim profile. She also was very poorly treated by the assistant district attorney. And she did a good job of describing that in the piece. And lastly, she's an excellent writer. So those are the things that I think made this particular story stand out. So here's an excerpt. So she says, before, as a consequence of post-traumatic stress, I dreamed every night that a different man raped me. In excruciating detail, I dreamed myself being raped by my closest friends, men I have loved and trusted, my family, and men I have purely imagined. Faithfully, every night, men would sink into my dreams and find me. Each night was a new and complex scenario. Each rape I was unprepared for and took me by surprise. I woke up each morning shaking, crying, and needing to throw up everything I had eaten the previous evening. Towards the end of her piece, she says, now, my dreams have not ceased, but the content has dramatically changed. I dream of telling my boss, the police, and my entire family of what happened. In my nightmares, no one believes me, and I'm thrown out of the room. I never know precisely who to tell or how. My words are never adequate or sufficient. I am tormented by this worry in both my waking and sleeping hours alike. So really a beautiful writer, right? And very, does a great job of conveying what she's gone through and the impact it's had on her. So it's important to keep that in mind as we move forward. Shortly after, our president at MIT sent an email to the campus, and this has never happened before. We've never had someone in the administration sort of publicly respond to a survivor story. And so he said a lot of things in this email, but an excerpt here is, he says, the suffering she describes breaks my heart. And as we know from years of campus reporting about sexual assault and from the comments posted on her letter, so the online version of her story had a lot of comments of people saying, this happened to me, I went through similar things. She is not alone. That such betrayals occur in our community makes me profoundly sad and angry. Nothing could be further from our ideal of a community founded on respect, decency, sympathy, and kindness. And as I was putting together this talk, I was talking to a colleague of mine who worked at Harvard at the time, and he made a really good point. He said that, schools aren't being judged by the fact that they have sexual assault happening on their campuses. They're being judged by their response, right? And so this is an example of a genuine, heartfelt, public response that I think really had an impact on the community. Excuse me. Furthermore, in that same response, he charged the chancellor, the brand new chancellor, with taking on the issue of sexual assault. So there were three things in this email that were really important. There is an explicit assignment of responsibility. So in that first line, you can see as Chancellor Cynthia Barnhart begins her new role, I have asked her to make the subject of sexual assault a central priority. So explicitly, the chancellor is on this issue. This is her issue now. She was specifically told to gather data. So the president says, our community deserves an assessment of what's happening here. And I think that resonated with people because the sense is that we are MIT, we are driven by data. And so this is what we need to do to start looking at this problem. And lastly, there was a firm public deadline set. So the chancellor was asked to give a report by the end of the semester. So these were all very important components of this response that really got the ball rolling on the survey. So I mentioned before that we were doing listening sessions around the same time. So our poor chancellor is a transportation engineer, okay? And she is a wonderful woman, and she really dove into the issue of sexual assault with, okay, I'm here, I'm working on it, I need to learn as much as I can. And so part of that education was working with our office, but also setting up listening sessions and having students from the community come in and simply talk to her about what they thought was important around sexual assault. So we had a series of sessions. They were divided up demographically. So we had female undergrads, female grads, male grads, gender nonconforming trans group, Title IX student working group, and then we had a group of survivors who worked with my office, Violence Prevention and Response, in the past over the years, so a survivor group. And one of the participants in the survivor group said this. So she said, "I've been recently trying to work. Because of alphabets, I must sit next to my abusive ex-boyfriend at commencement. And I've been trying to work with everyone who's in charge of commencement to see what the options are with that. All my interactions with them have been oddly aggressive and have made me feel very cornered and very much like I've done something wrong, and that it's weird that I'm making these requests or that it's not something worthwhile talking about over the complexities of commencement because it's complicated. So that's been my experience." So this is important for a number of reasons. One, if I had sat down with the other advocates in my office and been like, okay, we need to think about, barriers to our survivors being treated well and having a good experience at MIT, having to sit next to one's abuser at graduation is something I never would have thought of, right? And so it was helpful in that way, especially as we were constructing the survey. I think it was helpful for the chancellor in the same way to learn about what survivors experience, not as a group, but as individuals trying to navigate their environments post-violence. So the other thing is that this isn't an unusual request. I can pretty confidently guarantee that the people planning commencement have never received a request like this before. And so I don't show this quote to fault them really for the way that they reacted, but it's important to note that this kind of experience, even if this survivor had a positive experience for the rest of her 4 years at MIT, if she interacted with, say, the police and the disciplinary board and the advocate's office, and she had a positive experience everywhere, that interaction is enough to have her leave MIT and be like, MIT doesn't care about assault or violence. Like, this was my experience, right? That one interaction would be very undoing. Sorry, was that me? Okay, so moving on to our process and challenges along the way. So the first thing we did was create a working group, and it was comprised of people from these various offices. So obviously the chancellor, she was the person running the project. We had people from our Office of General Counsel, people from our, so MIT Medical is a clinic we have on campus. So MIT Medical, my office, Violence Prevention and Response, is actually within MIT Medical. We had people from our Dean of Graduate Education's office, we had people from Title IX, Student Life, and then we had people from institutional research. Does everyone know what institutional research is? Please raise your hand if you know what that is. Okay, so it's I like this half hand, yeah. Yeah. They just handle grants at your school. Okay. So at MIT, they do research basically on the student body. They do surveys like the senior, exit interview survey type of thing, and they do surveys on transportation needs on campus and different things like that. So this is sort of in their wheelhouse, although topic-wise, it was not in their wheelhouse. But they were a very important partner to have in this group. So even though this is a pretty large and varied group, we also had several stakeholders that weren't directly represented on the committee, but we had to keep in mind and involved throughout the process. So most importantly, students, right? We're going to be asking them questions. It's important to get their opinion, get their feedback, think about what they actually want to know about their peers and how they want to be asked about different things they've experienced. We also involved mental health, alcohol and other drug services, our judicial system, so other individual practitioners in medical, and student support services is an office that helps with academic accommodations for undergrads. So that was our last big person, yeah. So this is just an overview of how we developed the tool. So it was a very short timeline. We started, I think, mid-February, and the survey was open April 27th. Pretty quick turnaround. Yeah, thank you. Wow, right? Yeah, it's pretty tight. So this is just an overview. So we talked about timeline. So basically what happened was I created a draft of the survey by going to the literature and pulling in knowledge of the other advocates in my office. We got student input, like I mentioned. We had a couple sessions where we just brainstormed together and figured out what would make sense for our community. And so in doing that, we adjusted some of the items to fit the MIT context. This is, a wide range of things, but the most basic example would be on our campus, FSILGs are a common acronym, and that stands for fraternities, sororities, and independent living groups. So working language like that in, right, to let the community know that this is a survey for the MIT community. It's not a lifted standard tool. It's not something that was, taken from another campus, that sort of thing. We also added in MIT-specific items, so like the one I keep referencing about the intellectual standards in terms of getting into MIT. Also, there's an unfortunate, undercurrent of hearing the phrase, "that test raped me," is common on campus. I don't know if that's common on other campuses. It is. Okay. This is the first university I worked at, so I was like, oh, that's great. Okay. And so working that sort of thing in. Another example was we had people describing other students in really over-sexualized, kind of violent ways on listservs. So that was something we had to think about how to incorporate into the survey. And as you can see, there's a lot of committee revision. So we reviewed the tool after we got the student input. We sent it to our stakeholders, got feedback, reviewed it again. We actually did student testing with, I think, maybe 200 students and got feedback that way. And then finally, we opened it on April 27th. And it wasn't perfect by any means, and I will get to what we learned from this in a moment. In terms of challenges, there were a couple places where we had to balance certain elements, and I don't know that we ever figured out the answer, but it's more like we landed somewhere. So here's what I'm talking about. So we had to think about how specific do we want our data to be versus how long can the tool be and we still have students stay on to the end, or at least have a low drop-off rate. Also, thinking about the importance of various questions and where they should go in the survey. Like I said before, our victimization questions are, the driver for this survey, but we can't open with those, right? It just doesn't work that way. I'll leave that there, yes. And then also thinking about whether you want campus-specific data or the ability to compare to other campuses. You can have both, absolutely. But thinking about how going in one way might cost you something in the other direction. Another challenge was building consensus. So this is the list of offices that were on the working group. So chancellor, general counsel, et cetera, et cetera. All of these people were involved in the project because of their job, but also, honestly, because they care about the issue, right? There wasn't anyone there who's like, I have to be here and work on this survey. So I want to acknowledge that. At the same time, different offices have different perspectives, lenses that they're viewing the work through, different goals and things like that. And it's important to acknowledge that those don't always line up. Has anyone had experience with this sort of thing on their campus? Yeah. So it was challenging. It was definitely challenging. But I think part of the thing that helped us through was, I know I sort of went through the president's response email in depth, but honestly, him saying that the chancellor is in charge of this, you're going to collect data and it's due at the end of the semester, kept us on task. I think we could have gotten bogged down in, a million places. And I don't mean to give you the impression that this was an easy process or everyone got along the whole time, but we made it through because of those outside supports. Yeah. So, lessons learned. I think the most important thing that came out of this is the importance of planning in advance. That is very hard when you have a short timeline. But honestly, just simple things like figuring out what specific questions you want your data to answer, right? That's a very helpful exercise because it helps you determine what you want to ask about. And if you know what you want to ask about, you can devise your analysis and dissemination plans before you even send out the survey. It's also important to remember to go to the literature for guidance, right? No one needs to reinvent the wheel. We have really good tools that are out there. And if they don't really match your campus context or the culture of your student body, adapt them. It's okay, right? It's important to figure out what roles different people have in the group and to establish a decision-making process and structure right up front. Um, has anyone ever been in a meeting where the person in charge of the meeting is trying to make a decision based on like 100% consensus? You know what that feels like, right? Like you sort of go in circles. So it's important to have that mechanism, whatever it is, established at the beginning. Saves you a lot of time. Like I said, you can even create your analysis and dissemination plans in advance. So what does that mean? That means saying, okay, when the data comes in, I'm going to cross-tab question 7 and 42 because we want to be able to answer this question. And given this analysis plan, I think the most important things we're going to want to share with people are X, Y, and Z. And you can build a template of what you're going to share with the public and fill that in after you get the data. That is helpful because if you get any numbers that people aren't comfortable with, it saves you the sort of back and forth about whether you're going to share them because you've made those decisions in advance. And then having a timeline is really helpful. So a couple things we learned. I mentioned a lot earlier that our open-ended response opportunities were extremely, extremely valuable. And like I said, they were an afterthought in our process. We just thought we should have a comment box at the end of every page, basically. We definitely got feedback. We got feedback and realized some things after we ran the survey. So we're going to tweak a few items. There's a longer list, but here's an example of a few of them. So one of the sticking points as we were developing the survey was specificity of data and length of the tool, right? And so as we were talking about using the sexual experiences survey, the more recent version from 2007 asks about specific behaviors and it asks about specific tactics. So did you experience X behavior through force, threats, incapacitation, lies, different things like that. Because some people in our group felt that that made the survey way too long, our compromise was to ask the behavioral questions and then ask the tactics questions. What that means is that if someone had more than one experience, you can't connect the tactics to the experience. Additionally, one of the most common questions on campus has been, okay, so is it just happening in fraternities? Like, is that where it's happening? And actually, we can't answer that because when we asked about location, we talked about on campus, off campus, but we didn't separate that out. Additionally, I think there was an understanding that even though we cut the length a lot, it was still a lengthy tool when we put it out. And I think that was sort of okayed because there was this recognition of the fact that we didn't have any data on sexual assault at MIT. This was sort of, we were collecting information, but we were also sort of feeling in the dark. Like, what's an effective question? What do we need to find out more about? So, for example, we asked very few questions about sexual harassment and gender harassment. And one of the things that came through on the comments is people kept saying, especially graduate students, there's so much sexism on this campus. It's great you want to deal with sexual assault, but let's deal with sexism first. So great, our next iteration is going to look into that more deeply so we can figure out what to do. We had our sexual experiences survey adapted questions, and the thing that tool does not do a good job of covering is males being forced to penetrate others. And that is something that they ask about in the National Intimate and Sexual Violence Survey, but not something that's included in the Sexual Experiences Survey. And luckily for us, we had students say, hey, this happened to me. I don't, they were usually aggressive comments. This happened to me. I know you don't give a shit, but this is important. And so that was a huge learning experience for us. And, as advocates, we're like, oh my God, like, how could we have forgotten that? The last thing we want to do is like leave people's experiences out. So that was a very helpful series of comments that we got about that tool. Great. So just a few, don't know. I'm just going to talk about gathering quality data for a moment. This is probably repetitive for some of you, but it's things that I have found to be important as I've gone through the survey process. So thinking about data, you want to make sure that your data, the questions you ask, are valid and reliable. So what does that mean? It means that the questions you're asking are measuring what you think you're asking and that they measure it consistently. Okay. Also thinking about how representative your sample is of your population. If it's not perfectly representative, that's okay. You can do some statistical weighting, but it's important to know that information. And I know that sounds hypocritical because I don't have that information, but that is something you should know in future surveys. Making sure that your survey is comprehensive. So like I said before, not just asking about sexual assault, but all the things that are related to sexual assault. And also thinking about things like, okay, we think on campus that, drugging at parties is a big problem. So you can ask questions on the survey to test that assumption. Making sure that the data you collect is useful. So, people like me, I will say, who want to know everything, try and put a lot on a survey because you want to figure out what's going on. But make sure that the questions you're asking are going to be useful for what you're doing with the data, and also make sure that you're not, I don't know how to say this nicely, but like wasting survey takers' time. It's important. And then making sure that it is accessible, and that is something I'm going to spend a moment on. So, you can put a ton of energy and work into developing your tool and come up with something that is beautiful and, somehow magically short and asks all the things you want to know and, looks great. And you can set it up in a way that you're going to get amazing data and you know exactly what you're going to do with that data. But the piece that's missing there are the survey takers. Okay, so this is a weird framework. I haven't seen this done before, but my background is in public health, like I said. So there is a framework that is used to talk about healthcare and access to healthcare. And what I've done here is applied it to surveys because it lines up quite well, actually. So here's what I mean. So thinking about affordability. On the healthcare side, you can think about, if preventative services are too expensive, people aren't going to use them, and that's not good for healthcare, right? On the survey side, maybe there's no money changing hands, but think about how your students are perceiving the survey. Like, do I have the time to spend on this? Is there an incentive involved? Is that going to change how I feel about, spending time doing this survey? In terms of availability, so how long is the survey open for? Can I do part of it now and finish it later? I realize that accessibility is like the heading that I'm talking about, but accessibility is a part of access. So what do I have to do to access it? Can I take it on my phone? I think that's especially relevant for students nowadays. Accommodation, so thinking about if we have students with disabilities or differently abled students, or we have students who English is their second language, can we help them take the survey in some way, or are we just going to miss that population? And then lastly, acceptability. So is this something I'm comfortable answering? Does it reflect my experience? So again, thinking about how students might look at something and identify with it or not. So that's the importance of working in campus-specific items, answers, things like that. So after going through all of this, I've come up with sort of a general framework of things that I think are important and helpful as you move through the development of a campus climate survey. So there are two handouts on the conference site. One of them is this one, looks like this. It's called Overview of Considerations for Planning and Implementing a Campus Survey. It goes into a lot of depth, so I'm not going to go through it right now, but here are all the headings on it. So take a second and look. I mean, they include things like management and logistics, which I touched on, making sure you have a decision-making process in place. Survey administration methods. Are you doing it online? Are you doing a paper and pencil survey or something else? So all of these things are important. feel free to take a look at the handout. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to help you think through it, but that's available on the site. Additionally, there's a second handout. Can you tell that I love a handout? This one is a little different because it's supposed to be helpful in thinking through what you need on your working group to make this a successful endeavor. So the first one up there is political clout, influence, and power. Who's on your group that has that, right? You can spend all day talking about what the ideal tool would look like, and then if you don't have someone invested who has the power to make it happen, it's just going to sit around, right? So take a look at that. Again, happy to answer any questions about it, help you think through it. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that I have gone through a ton of information, and there's a lot of pieces to this, and it's not an easy process, and it can be extremely challenging in different ways, you know, from spending long hours going through the literature looking for tools that make sense to use, to that experience of, you know, butting heads with someone in your working group because you see things differently. And I mean, given all that, given the challenges of this process, I want to end on a positive note and say, like, why does it matter? Why does it matter if your tool collects exactly what you want it to collect? Why does it matter if it's campus specific, if students, you know, have supported what you're asking about? Here are a few comments from our survey that kind of make this worth it, I think. So someone said, I'm extremely grateful that the issue of sexual assault at MIT is being seriously considered and addressed to make the campus a safer place for all students. I want to acknowledge that part of this is it was a high visibility issue at the time, like I've mentioned. So it wasn't just a survey that resulted in this comment, I'm sure. But it's important to know that even if people don't take the survey on your campus, just the fact that you're doing it sends a message to the community that this is an important issue and we care about students. Someone said, this was an excellent survey written with great empathy for people who have been victims of sexual trauma or who exist outside of the gender binary. And then lastly, these are the people that like I do my work for. So I've been waiting for a survey like this to share my story anonymously. It was difficult, but I would do anything to help prevent sexual assault in the future. Which I think that's lovely. Just a side note, what we found on the survey was a third of our respondents who said they experienced sexual assault at MIT had never told anyone before revealing it on the survey. So, and yeah, that's all I have. Happy to take questions. Yes. I think that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for your questions and comments. My card is on the back table. My email address is up here. Please feel free to get in touch. They are. Yep, the slides are up there. Yeah, thank you.